The woman who did the work. My name is Ariana Mokoena, and for 6 years I worked at Crestline Holdings, a growing logistics company in Johannesburg. I was not the loudest person in the office, and I was never the one trying to impress anyone with big speeches in meetings. I was simply the woman who did the work. Every report that left our department passed through my hands. Every new employee who joined our team sat next to me for training. Every time a crisis appeared and deadlines were tight, I was the one who stayed late to fix it quietly without asking for recognition. I believed something very simple: if you work hard and stay consistent, your effort will speak for itself. When I joined the company at 25, I was determined to build a stable career. I came from a modest background, and this job meant everything to me. I arrived early every morning and sometimes left when the cleaners were already locking up. I learned every system inside out. I memorized client preferences. I improved reporting templates to make our department faster and more accurate. Over time, people began to rely on me. Colleagues would say, "Ask Ariana, she'll know." Even managers from other departments would come to me when they needed clarification. My direct manager was Victor Langford. On the surface, he was confident and polished. He wore expensive suits, spoke calmly in board meetings, and knew how to make executives laugh. He often praised me in private. He would say, "Ariana, you are one of my strongest employees," or, "I see leadership potential in you." For a long time, I believed him. When the operations manager position became available after my 3rd year, everyone assumed I would step into that role. I had the experience, the knowledge, and the results to support it. Victor called me into his office one afternoon and closed the glass door behind me. He smiled and said, "You're doing excellent work, Ariana, but the board feels you need a little more exposure before we promote you. Give it one more review cycle." I nodded and thanked him for the feedback. I walked out disappointed but still hopeful. 6 months later, another review cycle arrived, and again I found myself sitting across from him. This time the excuse was budget constraints. The next time it was about bringing in someone with external perspective. Still, I stayed loyal. I told myself patience was part of the journey. Then one Monday morning we were all called into a department meeting. Victor stood confidently at the front and announced, "I'd like you all to welcome our new operations supervisor." A young woman named Tanya Reed stepped forward. She had recently graduated, and this was her first leadership role. The room filled with polite applause, and I joined in, though my hands felt heavy. Within minutes I understood what was happening. Tanya was now my supervisor. 6 years of experience suddenly meant less than a fresh degree and a confident introduction. That afternoon Victor called me into his office again. "I hope you understand," he said smoothly, "Tanya brings a fresh perspective to the team." I carefully asked, "I thought I was being prepared for that position." He leaned back in his chair and replied, "You're valuable where you are, Ariana. Not everyone is meant for leadership. Not everyone is meant for leadership." Those words stayed in my mind long after I left his office. From that point forward, things began to change in subtle ways. Tanya would ask me how to run reports, how to structure meetings, and how to handle client complaints. I guided her because I believed in professionalism. Yet during management meetings, Victor praised her improvements and new ideas, many of which were systems I had built years earlier. At first I convinced myself that recognition did not matter as long as the work was done well. But then small irregularities began to appear. Reports I submitted would later show adjustments I did not make. Deadlines would be discussed as though I had missed them even when I had confirmation emails showing otherwise. Victor began calling me into his office with printed documents in hand. "Ariana, this performance is concerning," he would say calmly. I would look at the numbers and feel a quiet confusion because they were not the figures I had submitted. One afternoon after a tense budget meeting, he told me something that made my instincts sharpen. "Next time adjust the forecast upward," he said in a low voice. "The board doesn't need every detail. We'll correct it next quarter." There was no email. No written instruction. Just his voice and a serious expression. Then he added, "Let's keep this between us." That was the moment something shifted inside me. It was not anger and it was not fear. It was clarity. I began to see a pattern forming, a quiet movement of responsibility and blame positioning itself in one direction. I went home that evening and sat at my kitchen table thinking carefully. I thought about the missed promotions, the altered reports, the verbal instructions, and the subtle comments about leadership. For the first time I asked myself whether I was simply being overlooked or deliberately positioned. The next morning I made a quiet decision. I would protect myself. I started documenting every meeting in detail, writing down dates, times, and exact phrases. Eventually I began recording conversations I was part of, not to cause harm but to preserve truth. I told no one. I continued doing my work with the same dedication and professionalism as before. If you have ever worked hard and felt invisible, if you have ever sensed that something was not right but could not prove it, then you understand the space I was in. I did not know it yet, but those recordings would soon become the only thing standing between me and total professional destruction. And before we continue to Chapter 2, if you are enjoying this story, make sure you hit the subscribe button and join this community. These stories travel across the world, so tell me in the comments which country you are watching from right now. The pattern: after I started documenting everything, I became more observant than ever. I paid attention to tone, to timing, to who was copied in emails and who was not. I noticed how Victor would give instructions verbally during meetings and then later deny ever saying them. I noticed how Tanya slowly stopped asking for my guidance directly and instead began presenting my ideas as if they were her own. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore. A modified number here. A reworded report there. But then the pressure increased. One Tuesday morning, I arrived at work to find 3 urgent emails marked high priority. All of them were about a client forecast that had apparently been submitted incorrectly. According to the thread, I had underestimated projected costs, which could affect quarterly targets. My name was highlighted in bold in Victor's message to upper management. This oversight came from Ariana's desk. "We are addressing it internally." My heart dropped as I opened the attachment. The spreadsheet displayed figures that were different from what I had finalized. Entire columns had been adjusted upward. The timestamps showed edits made late at night, hours after I had logged out of the system. I checked the version history quietly. The edits were not mine. But before I could gather my thoughts, my phone rang. "Ariana, my office." "Now," Victor said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. When I stepped into his office, Tanya was already seated there. Victor closed the door and placed the printed spreadsheet on the desk between us. "This is becoming a pattern," he said. "We cannot afford these mistakes." I took a breath and responded carefully. "These figures were changed after I submitted the report. The version I sent was accurate." Victor looked at me with a measured expression. Are you suggesting someone altered it? His tone implied accusation rather than curiosity. I am saying the data in this copy does not match the one I finalized, I replied. Tanya shifted in her seat and added softly, I assumed Ariana double-checked before sending. The way she said it felt rehearsed, like a line delivered at the right cue. Victor sighed and leaned back. Excuses will not fix the problem. Accountability will. The word accountability echoed in my mind. I nodded and said nothing further. I could feel the narrative forming, slowly but deliberately. Over the next few weeks, similar incidents occurred. A client complained about delayed communication even though I had proof of timely responses. A supplier agreement was labeled incomplete despite my documented submission. Each time, the issue was brought up publicly in team meetings. Each time, Victor's eyes would rest on me as if disappointment had become permanent. What troubled me most was the consistency. It was too organized to be random. I began reviewing everything twice, sometimes 3 times, before submitting it. I forwarded confirmation emails to my personal archive. I saved meeting summaries immediately after discussions ended. And I continued recording conversations where directives were given verbally. One afternoon, Victor called me into his office alone. His tone was softer than usual. Ariana, I am trying to protect you, he said. The board is asking questions. If this continues, it will reflect badly on your file. I held his gaze. Then I need clarity on expectations. I follow every instruction you give. He paused briefly before responding. Some instructions require flexibility. You need to understand how business works at higher levels. There it was again, the suggestion that I lacked leadership awareness. Then he lowered his voice and added, sometimes numbers need to look stronger temporarily. It is strategic. I felt the weight of that statement. So you are asking me to adjust reports beyond actual performance? I asked calmly. He did not answer directly. I am asking you to be a team player, he replied. I left his office with a steady expression, but inside I felt something settle firmly into place. This was no longer about performance. It was about positioning. If the department failed, someone needed to absorb the blame. And slowly, that someone was being shaped to look like me. A week later, the situation escalated further. HR sent me a formal warning notice citing repeated performance concerns. My hands trembled slightly as I read it. The document listed the altered forecast, the delayed client communication, and the incomplete supplier agreement. Each point had a date and official reference. It looked convincing. If I were an outsider reading it, I might have believed it. I walked to Melissa Grant's office in HR and requested clarification. She scanned the document and said, "These concerns are coming from your manager. We rely on departmental leadership for accuracy." Her words were neutral, but the message was clear. The foundation beneath me was being quietly removed. That evening, I stayed late reviewing months of saved files and recordings. I organized everything by date and cross-referenced instructions with outcomes. A clear pattern emerged. Verbal directives from Victor often preceded the very issues later attributed to me. Adjustments he suggested verbally would later appear as independent decisions in official documentation. The realization was chilling, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed my instincts. The pattern was intentional. I sat in the dim office light and understood something important. The situation was moving toward a climax. Either I would accept the blame and leave quietly, or I would stand firm and defend myself. And if that moment came, I would not walk in empty-handed. I closed my laptop, placed my recorder carefully into my bag, and prepared for whatever was coming next. The firing the meeting invitation came on a Thursday morning at 9:12 a.m. The subject line was short and formal: performance review, urgent. It was scheduled for 11 a.m. in the main boardroom. Not Victor's office. Not a private discussion room. The boardroom. That was when I knew this was no longer a warning. It was a decision. I sat at my desk staring at the screen for a few seconds, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Around me, the office carried on as usual. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. Someone laughed near the break area. The world had not changed, but mine was about to. I quietly opened the folder on my computer labeled Meetings. Inside were dated audio files, screenshots, forwarded emails, and documented summaries. I reviewed 3 specific recordings. The ones that mattered most. Then I transferred copies to a secure cloud drive and sent a backup to my personal email. Not because I planned to use them immediately, but because I understood how quickly access can disappear when termination becomes official. At 10:55 a.m., I stood up, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the boardroom. My steps were steady. When I opened the door, Victor was already seated at the far end of the long polished table. Tanya sat to his right. Melissa Grant from HR sat to his left with a folder in front of her. There was an empty chair waiting for me on the opposite side. The atmosphere felt rehearsed. Controlled. I greeted them politely and took my seat. Victor folded his hands on the table and offered a tight smile. "Thank you for coming, Ariana." Melissa avoided direct eye contact. Tanya stared at a notebook she wasn't writing in. Victor began speaking in a tone that sounded almost sympathetic. "Over the past few months, we've had several discussions regarding your performance. Despite feedback and formal warnings, we have not seen sufficient improvement." He slid a document across the table toward me. I looked down at the heading, Notice of Termination. The words were clear and bold. My name appeared beneath them. Effective immediately, Victor continued, Crestline Holdings is terminating your employment due to repeated negligence and failure to meet performance standards. 6 years of loyalty summarized in one sentence. Melissa gently pushed the paper closer to me along with a pen. "You'll need to sign acknowledgement of receipt," she said quietly. I felt the weight of the moment. For a brief second, I allowed myself to imagine what they expected: tears, panic, maybe an argument. But I had already moved past that stage weeks ago. I placed my handbag on the table and opened it slowly. Victor misread the motion and leaned back confidently in his chair. "This is a difficult decision," he added, "but accountability is important at every level." Accountability. The same word he had used before. I removed my phone and placed it face down on the table. Then I looked directly at him. "Before I sign anything," I said calmly, "I would like to clarify a few points on record." Melissa straightened slightly. Victor nodded, appearing patient. "Go ahead." I turned the phone over and opened a folder labeled by date. On March 14th, I began, "You instructed me verbally to adjust the quarterly forecast upward despite the actual numbers." You specifically said the board did not need the full picture and that we would correct it later. Victor's expression tightened. I don't recall that, he replied quickly. I tapped the screen. I do. I pressed play. His voice filled the boardroom speakers clearly and unmistakably. Ariana, increase the projection. The board expects stronger numbers. We'll balance it next quarter. The room froze. Tanya's eyes widened slightly. Melissa looked from me to Victor without speaking. I stopped the recording and opened another file. On April 2nd, I continued, you told me not to document a supplier adjustment in writing. I pressed play again. Don't email that, his recorded voice said. Just handle it quietly. Victor's face lost its color. This is inappropriate, he said sharply. You cannot record private conversations. I met his gaze evenly. South African law allows one-party consent for recordings when the person recording is part of the conversation. Silence followed. Not the kind filled with tension alone, but the kind filled with realization. Melissa slowly closed the folder in front of her. Victor, she said carefully, is that your voice? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he shifted in his chair. This is taken out of context, he argued. Leadership requires strategic flexibility. I opened one final recording. If compliance asks, we'll say you misunderstood the directive. His voice echoed again, leaving little room for interpretation. I paused the audio and placed my phone flat on the table. The altered reports referenced in my warnings match the dates of these verbal instructions, I said calmly. The version histories show edits made after my submissions. I have preserved copies. Melissa inhaled slowly, processing everything. Tanya remained silent, her earlier confidence gone. Victor stood abruptly. This meeting is over, he snapped. But it wasn't. Not anymore. The balance of power had shifted quietly, just as I knew it would. Melissa looked at him firmly. No, Victor. This meeting is not over. She turned toward me. Ariana, please forward those files to HR immediately. For the first time since I entered the room, I saw uncertainty in Victor's posture. The narrative he had been building for months was unraveling in real time. I had walked in as the employee being dismissed. I was now the employee presenting evidence. The termination letter remained unsigned on the table between us. I gathered my phone calmly. I am prepared to cooperate fully with any internal investigation, I said. My voice did not shake. Victor said nothing further. The confidence he wore like a tailored suit had slipped. As I left the boardroom, I understood something important. This was no longer about saving my job. It was about protecting my integrity. And the story was far from over. If you are still watching, make sure you subscribe because Chapter 4 reveals what happened after those recordings reached the board. And tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. What happened next shocked everyone in that office. The investigation within 24 hours of that boardroom meeting, everything changed. I arrived at work the next morning expecting tension, whispers, maybe even cold stares. Instead, I walked into something quieter. Controlled, cautious silence. Victor's office door was closed. Not slightly open like usual. Fully closed. By 10 a.m., an email from HR was sent to the entire department. It was brief and carefully worded. Mr. Victor Langford will be temporarily stepping away from his duties pending an internal review. During this time, all operational reporting should be directed to the Executive Oversight Committee. There was no mention of why. No details. But everyone knew something serious had happened. Tanya avoided eye contact with me when we crossed paths near the printer. The confidence she once carried had disappeared. By midday, Melissa called me into her office. This time, there was no termination letter on the desk. Instead, there was a legal pad filled with notes. "Ariana," she said calmly, "the board has requested a formal internal investigation. We need you to submit every file, recording, and document you referenced yesterday." I nodded. I already organized everything. I handed her a flash drive along with printed summaries that linked each recording to specific dates, altered reports, and formal warnings issued against me. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment without knowing exactly when it would come. Melissa looked through the documentation carefully. "This is very detailed," she said. "I needed it to be," I replied. Over the next few days, IT conducted a full audit of departmental systems. They reviewed login histories, file modifications, metadata timestamps, and email trails. The version history of the altered forecasts showed edits made from Victor's credentials late at night. The supplier agreement marked incomplete had been finalized by me but later reopened and modified from his account. Each piece of evidence aligned with the timeline in my documentation. The narrative that had once painted me as negligent was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the office shifted noticeably. Conversations stopped when I walked by, not out of hostility, but out of uncertainty. People were processing what was unfolding. Some quietly approached me in the break room. "I always wondered about those reports," one colleague whispered. Another said, "You were always the most thorough person here." It was strange hearing validation after months of subtle blame. On Friday afternoon, the Executive Oversight Committee called me in for a formal statement. 3 board members sat across from me in a smaller conference room. Their questions were precise. "When did you begin documenting conversations? Did anyone else have access to your files? Were you ever directly instructed to falsify numbers in writing?" I answered clearly and factually. I did not exaggerate. I did not speculate. I simply presented truth supported by evidence. After nearly 2 hours, one board member leaned back and said quietly, "Thank you, Ariana. This has been illuminating." That evening, another email was sent company-wide. Effective immediately, Victor Langford has resigned from his position for personal reasons. An interim operations director will be appointed while leadership restructuring takes place. Personal reasons. The same phrase companies often use when the real reason is too damaging to publish. The following Monday, Melissa asked me to meet again. This time, her tone carried a different energy. "The board has reviewed the findings," she began. "The warnings placed on your file will be removed. Your employment record will reflect no misconduct." I listened carefully. "Additionally," she continued, "the board would like to formally apologize for the handling of your case. You were placed in an unfair position." The words felt surreal. Weeks ago, I was being labeled incompetent. Now the same institution was correcting itself. "There's more," she added. "The operations manager position is open again. The board believes you are the strongest candidate." For a moment, I said nothing. The promotion I had worked toward for years was finally being offered, after exposure, investigation, and near termination. It would have been easy to accept immediately. It would have felt like victory. But something inside me had changed. I had seen how easily narratives could be constructed. I had experienced how quickly silence from leadership can isolate someone. Trust, once fractured, does not fully return overnight. I appreciate the offer, I said slowly, but I need time to consider my future. Melissa nodded in understanding. As I walked back to my desk, I realized the power dynamic had completely shifted. I was no longer the employee defending herself. I was the professional who had protected her integrity under pressure. The recordings had not only saved my job, they had revealed the truth. And yet, this story was not simply about exposing wrongdoing. It was about recognizing value. Sometimes when an organization shows you how easily it can discard you, it forces you to ask whether staying is truly growth, or just comfort. The decision the week after Victor's resignation felt unreal. The office that once carried tension now carried caution. Conversations were softer. Emails were more detailed. Meetings were recorded officially. It was as if the entire company had suddenly remembered the importance of transparency. The board scheduled one final meeting with me on Friday afternoon. This time, the atmosphere was completely different from the day I was almost terminated. There was no accusation in the room. No rehearsed disappointment. Only professionalism. The interim director began by acknowledging my years of contribution. Ariana, your documentation did not just protect you. It protected the company from a much larger legal and financial issue. Another board member added, integrity at your level of responsibility is rare. We underestimated you. Those words stayed with me. We underestimated you. For years, I had underestimated myself too. I had waited patiently for recognition instead of demanding clarity. I had trusted verbal promises instead of requiring written accountability. I had believed loyalty alone guaranteed security. That illusion was gone now. The operations manager offer was placed on the table again, this time formally documented with salary details, expanded authority, and a written commitment to structural reform in the department. It was everything I had worked toward. Everything I thought I wanted. But over the past week, something unexpected had happened. Other companies had heard about the internal restructuring at Crestline. One competitor reached out discreetly through LinkedIn. They had seen my published operational frameworks from past conferences. They wanted to meet. I attended the interview quietly, not out of revenge, but out of curiosity. What I discovered changed my perspective. The competing firm valued systems, transparency, and documented leadership processes. They asked me about long-term strategy, not short-term optics. They offered not only a higher salary but also executive mentorship and direct board access. For the first time in my career, I felt evaluated for my capability, not positioned as a convenient shield. So when I sat in that final meeting at Crestline, I already knew my answer. I looked at the board members calmly. I am grateful for the opportunity, I began. But I have decided to pursue another direction. There was visible surprise in the room. One member asked, "Is this about what happened?" I shook my head slightly. It's about growth. What happened simply showed me what I need moving forward. They respected my decision. We agreed on a structured transition period where I would help stabilize operations before my departure. There was no hostility. No drama. Just professionalism. On my final day, I packed my office slowly. The same desk where I had once felt powerless now felt small. Colleagues stopped by to thank me. Some apologized for staying silent when things felt wrong. I didn't hold resentment. Silence often comes from fear, not malice. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I felt something stronger than victory. I felt clarity. Victor thought he was ending my career when he scheduled that termination meeting. He believed the narrative he built would stand unchallenged. He didn't know I had been quietly collecting truth. But more importantly, he didn't know that his actions would push me into a position far greater than the one I almost lost. 3 months later, I stepped into my new role as Senior Operations Director at a company that valued accountability as much as results. My salary increased. My authority expanded. And my confidence transformed. The recordings remain saved, not as weapons, but as reminders. Reminders that preparation matters. Reminders that silence does not equal weakness. Reminders that the strongest person in the room is often the one who speaks last, but with proof. If there is one lesson in this story, it is this: protect your work, protect your name, and never assume that loyalty alone will protect your future. Documentation is not distrust. It is wisdom. And sometimes, the very moment someone tries to erase you becomes the moment you redefine yourself. If this story inspired you, make sure you subscribe to the channel because more powerful stories are coming. And before you go, tell me in the comments which country you are watching from. I always read them, and it reminds me that strength and resilience have no borders.